It is wonderful to see everybody again. I've had the opportunity, so thank you so much. Rebecca and the boys and I are just back from a 10-day RV adventure out to South Dakota to see Mount Rushmore and the Badlands. 2,500 miles, 6 different states, 6 different campsites, 3 visits to Walmart, and just the 4 stars and 250,000 motorcycle enthusiasts who headed out west and back in this last week. It was quite an adventure, I have to tell you. Me not being such a camper, it was really an interesting and novel idea that we should have this experience. After all, it makes sense after being essentially quarantined together, just the 4 of us in our house for the last 5 months. Why wouldn't we go from our house into a 25-foot camper and spend even more time together, just the 4 of us? But the truth is that without being able to stay at hotels or travel by airplane or even eat out at restaurants, this is what made sense to give my kids something to remember this summer by, other than that what they couldn't do, right? Well, there's a lot of this summer what our kids can't do. We wanted to give them something that they could do and a really positive memory. So sure enough, Rebecca, the boys and I piled into this 25-foot long, 12-foot high RV to begin our 2,500-mile adventure to South Dakota and back. And I'll tell you, the first day started out great. I was comfortable on the road, driving Michigan. Well, I guess you drive Michigan, you kind of drive like this through all the potholes. And then I'm feeling like I really got a handle on this RV. And then we hit Chicago rush hour traffic in the RV. Yes, Chicago rush hour traffic in the RV. And I will tell you, I turned the radio down because, somehow you can't focus when the music is up loud. So I turned the radio down, like the old man that I am. And I gripped hard onto the wheels of the RV and I focused. Because the most important people in the world to me were there in this 25-foot long RV. And I had to protect them. And I went into instinctual protection mode. And it was just the 4 of us against the world. Well, the 4 of us against Chicago rush hour traffic. And sure enough, we made it through to spend a beautiful Shabbat in Union, Illinois, on the west side of Illinois. And on Sunday, our journey continued westward as I drove this RV into Wisconsin and then down the Mississippi River Valley. As we drove across the Mississippi River Valley, all of a sudden, hurricane force winds kicked up. And it just was blowing. I bet the winds must have been blowing probably 200 miles an hour as I drove this 12-foot by 25-foot sail across Minnesota. And the winds just kept blowing harder and harder, 250 miles an hour, 350 miles an hour. And I'm not kidding. I had the wheel like this, well, more like this, as the winds were blowing. And I was just trying to keep the RV straight. But it was the 4 of us against the world, well, against the winds. And I had to keep my family safe, and those instincts for protection took over. And it was the 4 of us against everybody. And by the way, as my wheel was going like this, just to try to stay safe, I've got 250,000 motorcycles driving by me at the speed of light. I don't know how they do it, and I don't know how they stood up straight, but they did. And we camped the night in in eastern South Dakota. We spent the night in Mitchell, South Dakota. And then we continued the journey the next day. And sure enough, we got past the winds, but I will tell you, we reached the mountains. And I'm driving in this RV through the mountains of South Dakota. Now, these are the tallest things in the world. I don't know if you've ever experienced the mountains of South Dakota, but they aren't rolling hills. They're straight up and they're straight down the whole way through. And so sure enough, we reached the final leg as I exited I-90 West in Rapid City, South Dakota. And we looped our way around just following whatever Waze told us to go. And sure enough, as we reached our last leg to get to Culver's Gulch, the RV campsite, that just rolls off the tongue, Culver's Gulch, or Custer's Gulch, pardon me, not Culver's, Custer's Gulch, we reached the base of this mountain. And Waze told me to snake my way around these switchbacks, all the way up the side of the mountain to get to our campsite. And I will tell you, as I was going 15 miles an hour, because that was actually the speed limit at some points, around the side of this mountain with death on this side and death on this side, it was the 4 of us against this mountain. And, the 250,000 bikers who were looping around me. But it was us against the world, and my instincts took over till we finally got to Custer's Gulch, safe and sound, when I could exhale for a few days. It was quite an adventure, I must tell you. So it was kind of with that in mind and my need to take over and protect my family, that instinct to protect my family, that I turned to this week's Torah portion, Parshat Shoftim. And our Torah portion begins, of course, speaking about the judges and moves from there to speaking about kings. But then in chapter 18, our Torah portion, Deuteronomy chapter 18, switches to talk about the Levi'im, the priests. And it speaks about them very interestingly, because the first word that it comes to address with regard to the priests is lo, is you shall not. And now again, let's take it into context, because here Moses is preparing our ancestors to enter the promised land without him, right? He's preparing them, each and every one of the tribes, to inherit their land and to set up this just and fair society based on service to God and care for each other. And so in chapter 18, we read, Lo yiyeh kohanim al va'im, kol shevet Levi chelek v'nachala, right? That is to say, lo, the Levitical priests, the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no territorial portion within Israel, right? Each and every tribe had their own land, but the Israelites, they got no land. They got no land. The Torah continues, they shall live only off the Lord's gifts as their portion, and shall have no portion among their brothers' tribes. The Lord is their portion as God promised them. The Torah continues, this then shall be the priest's due from the people. Everyone who offers a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, but not the bison that I saw on the way, everyone who offers an ox or a sheep must give the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach to the priest. You shall also give to the priest the first fruits of your new grain and wine and oil, and the first shearing of your sheep. For the Lord your God has chosen him and his descendants out of all your tribes to be in attendance for service in the name of the Lord for all time. Now, how could it be that the Levites, right, of whom the subset is the Kohanim, the high priest, these Levites who dedicated themselves to God, how could it be that they received no land whatsoever? In some ways, it would make sense for them to inherit Yerushalayim, right, Jerusalem. But Jerusalem, much like Washington, D.C., much later, Jerusalem was meant to belong to no single tribe, but instead to belong to every tribe. So how could it be that the Levites received no land at all? These people whose sole goal in life, whose role was to help bring the people Israel closer to God. How could it be that they received no land? And so as I thought about this, and I was really studying it because I found no commentary on it, I realized that in the ancient times, our ancestors' ability to worship God was entirely tied up with giving to others. Our ancestors' ability to worship God was entirely tied up with giving to others. They knew that in bringing their sacrifice, their method of saying thank you to God, their method of saying I'm sorry to God, their method of asking God for whatever their prayers might be, was entirely tied up with caring for others. And just like the mitzvah that says you shall love your neighbor as yourself, just like the mitzvah that you should love the stranger, our ancestors were again challenged to get outside of their own selfish needs and to give and to care for others. In this case, the Levites. So it is with that in mind that we turn to Elul, to this last month of the Jewish year as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah. And just this last week, we marked Rosh Chodesh Elul, and we're now beginning the true count up to Rosh Hashanah. And as we'll read on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it says, "By Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed, who shall live and who shall die, who by fire and who by water." And of course, we know that prayer, the Unatan HaTokef, concludes with Tfilah, Teshuvah, Utzedakah, that prayer, repentance, and charity avert the severe decree. Prayer, repentance, and charity avert the severe decree. We know about prayer. We do prayer every day. But sometimes we forget that just as our ancestors' prayer was tied up not only in the act of asking God for something, but in the act of caring for God's people, that our prayers are most accepted when they're accompanied by charity. I'll say it again, that our prayers are most accepted when they're accompanied by charity. Because then it's not just about us and what we want and what we need. It's about how we can care for God's children. And when we care more acutely for God's children, then our prayers are accepted with even more blessing and grace. Prayer, repentance, and charity avert the severe decree. As we go forward in these weeks of Elul and anticipate Rosh Hashanah, as we really begin to look inward at our own actions and ask that our prayers are elevated even higher, let us also remember that when they're accompanied by charitable giving, that our prayers are accepted even more strongly. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about us and what we want. It's about how we care for others and how we uplift those who are in need. So as we look to these coming weeks and we remember that prayer, repentance, and charity avert the severe decree, let me remind you that your synagogue family is always in need of support. But also, let me just call out two significant organizations worthy of our support in the coming weeks, of all the many, many organizations, and that's Yad Ezra and Jewish Senior Living. Let us help those who can't even put food on their table, and let us really care for the aged among us most affected by COVID-19 and this global pandemic. There are lots of other wonderful charities, and you should support them as well, but I'll just call to mind those particular organizations. We remember when times get tough like they're in now, when the waves of rush hour traffic are coming against us, when the winds are blowing against us at 250,000 miles an hour, or when we're climbing up the side of a mountain and our instincts take over that we just want to protect ourselves, let's remember that's when the Torah comes to tell us, no, you have an obligation to care for others. And if you really want God to protect your own, then you have to care for God's children as well. Now, I'll tell you, as we drove up the side of that mountain, all I kept thinking was, how in the world am I going to get down from Custer's Gulch? How am I going to get down this mountain? And will the brakes of this Ford E350, will they make it? But I had a hunch. And yes, your rabbi every now and again has some sparks of wisdom. So I went to the staff at the RV campsite desk. And I said, I know that if I turn right and go back down the mountain, that the incline is about like this, and then I'll be entirely reliant on the brakes and my prayers. I said, but as I look this way, if I turn left out of Custer's Gulch, if I turn left out of the RV site, it looks like a very different path. And sure enough, the staff person at the RV campsite said, wait, you came up from that direction? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, that was kind of dumb, because if you go this way, it's a truck route all the way around Rapid City to I-90. And it's just beautiful rolling hills. So among the many lessons that I learned, in addition to when you really want to care for your own family, you have to give charity and care for others. What I learned is that when you drive an RV, you just can't rely on Waze. You got to look at the RV directions and the truck routes to really get your way back. And sure enough, having learned that lesson, I made my way back a little less painfully, with a little less anxiety, all the way from Rapid City, South Dakota, back through Minnesota, back through Wisconsin, back through Illinois and Indiana, and into Detroit once again, where I came home. And the very first thing we did after arriving home is I gave some tzedakah. May God bless us in this coming month of Elul with the wisdom to pursue tefillah and teshuvah, prayer and repentance. May we also be wise enough to accompany our prayers with acts of tzedakah, of righteous giving. Shabbat Shalom.